You know, when I first heard of Dungeon Meshi, I thought it looked and sounded pretty boring, to be honest. Just a bunch of episodic adventures of a small group of adventurers that just really like cooking. But after catching up to it, I don't think I could have been more wrong about the series, and it genuinely might just be one of my favorite mangas ever now. And there will be spoilers, but I'm going to avoid anything major that might ruin the story entirely. So there's your warning. Dungeon Meshi, or the stupid English name Delicious in Dungeon, is a fairly standard dungeon exploring adventure manga following a small party immediately after a fatal encounter with a red dragon in the depths of the dungeon that left the party split and one of the members eaten. The remaining trio decided to go back into the dungeon as soon as possible to retrieve and resurrect their fallen comrade. With little to no money, they're basically left with the only option of getting their food from within the dungeon to waste as little time as possible, because it's a lot harder to resurrect someone after they've been digested. And as they're beginning their journey back, they end up running into a dwarf who knows quite a bit about preparing food from within the dungeon. And then the four of them begin their adventure while eating just about everything they come across along the way. That's the basic rundown of the start of the story, and it comes off as a more episodic start, which I thought originally, where all the chapters are about very specific meals that they're having, with the only real thing connecting the story is the fact that they're working towards a goal the entire time, but it just heavily focuses on the characters and the food that they're currently making instead. But there's a hard switch in the story around chapter 23 that just completely changes the focus from the food to a beautifully crafted dark adventure that also leans pretty heavily into comedy. There are moments in the early chapters where things get foreshadowed and questions get asked, but I feel like during the Red Dragon encounter is where everything starts to build up into one of the best stories that I've read in quite a while, that constantly makes you want to read more and learn about everything that this world has to offer. It's written in a way that never really overloads you with information and gives you just enough to explain things by letting the world build up around the story as it continues on. You don't really need to understand how the world works until it's very important for the plot. So it releases the lore and exposition in like small batches without feeling like they just forgot to mention it or it's coming completely out of nowhere. I think that starting it off with a very specific focal point of just making food and exploring this dungeon, and then slowly introducing more of the world as it progresses, was an extremely effective method of storytelling that allowed me to get into it a lot more and more invested into the story than I normally would have if it was done in a more standard way that most stories go. The main characters throughout the series do build up a pretty standard adventuring party though, which I'll always have a slight annoyance about, but it's not that much of an actual issue in this since the personalities of the characters really outshine any grievances that I can think of about how generic the group of them actually feels. When the entire group only consists of one person from each race, and everyone just kind of fits into their fantasy genre defined roles, I get a bit bored of it and just want something different. It works in just about every story, so I really can't complain too much about it. They do get a pass from me though with the amount of side characters that get introduced and take up portions of the story, because with all of the other characters they do end up in different party groupings that feel less like generic D&D parties and more like actual groups of people from similar backgrounds or professions working with others to clear the dungeon. There's even a couple chapters where the main character gets race swapped and they get to experience everything from a bit of a different perspective, which I thought was a pretty interesting way to mess with the generic feeling dynamic of the party. Looking at it somewhat logically, it probably makes more sense to try and min-max groupings with different skill sets and combat abilities, but I don't really think that in a realistic scenario with adventurers, it would end up in a bunch of smaller groups of people who just team up or get hired with the mentality of one person from each race or nation to try and min-max their abilities. And personally, I just like to see less of that in stories, with a bit more emphasis on like unique group pairings, rather than one person from each representing group. I think it really annoys me because it just makes everything run too smoothly, almost. Whereas if you have one character from every race, there's not really a whole lot of overlapping skill sets in this like generic grouping, so each person has their own like specific skill set in the party. So when conflicts come up, they just kind of run through everything in their own ways. Whereas if you had a bunch of characters that fulfilled one specific thing, they would be forced into problem solving and finding different workarounds for things that they just couldn't fulfill because they're missing like the specific character traits that they just don't have in the party. I think it would just make everything a bit more interesting for me personally. At least that's how I feel about the whole generic grouping of characters. I very well could just be completely alone on this island, but whatever. But I don't really think it matters all that much, and to be fair, most of the time, it is specifically the main character's grouping that ends up like that, but it's still just a bit annoying for me, considering just how abundant it is in storytelling, where they don't really go with an entire party of elves, for example. Except in this story, they have the Canaries, which is exactly that. An entire party of elves that come in and clear the dungeons when they become too unstable and start to breach the surface and cause a lot of casualties. I really like the Canaries, and I think that they bring a certain urgency to the story where it feels like everything's much bigger than it seemed at first. And then you get to learn a lot more because of their influence and how much they actually push for the dungeon to be cleared immediately, just because of all of the information that they have on the dungeon that for some reason they decide not to share with anyone until it's absolutely necessary, which is kind of annoying, but at the same time, they think such little of every other race that has a smaller lifespan than they do, so they just come in and basically force their will upon everyone else because they know what's best for the world, I guess, which ends up forcing them into the antagonistic role of the series, but they're really not that antagonistic and they're just trying to help, but it certainly comes off as them being the bad villains of the series until you learn the information that they have, which actually completely changes everything, and they're just kind of arrogant assholes who think they understand everything that's going on, but they don't really because they don't have all of the information, but they've dealt with things like this before, so they think that they know exactly what's happening, even though it's not really as black and white as they think. But I do really like them. They really slot into like a lesser villain role, which I think suits them pretty well. But I might have jumped the gun talking about the Canaries right now. I probably should have started with the main characters. The main character group consists of a human, Leos, an elf, Marcel, a dwarf, Senshi, and a halfling, Chilchuk. They do end up adding another party member partway through the series, and she's a beastkin, Izutsumi, making the current members 5, but technically 6 if you want to include Leos' sister Fallon, who was the member of the original party that ended up getting eaten by the red dragon. But she's more of a side character that doesn't have as much participation as the rest, so I don't really consider her to be an actual main group character, but more of an end goal and a way to make the characters grow as they're forced to make tough decisions about her. But Leos is the generic like warrior knight leader who is pretty decent at combat, but where he really excels is in his knowledge of the dungeon and just the monsters that inhabit it. Mainly, he's really focused on the monsters to the point of being extremely obsessed with them and wanting to become a monster if it's possible. He's constantly wanting to cook and eat just about everything they come across in the dungeon, and he's the one who really pushes for them to eat everything, despite the protesting of just about every other character. Marcel is the magic user of the group. She went to the same magic school as Leos' sister Fallon, where they became very close friends. Fallon excelled in natural talent, but Marcel was extremely book smart and learned as much as she could about all kinds of magic while working towards a goal. She is without a doubt the most against eating monsters within the party, constantly displeased with their meals until she actually tries them, and then she's okay with it. She basically fights the entire time to just eat normal food. I think she hides a lot of her true feelings throughout the series, and it really shows later on when all of her desires and thoughts come to the surface. And you really get to learn more about her as a character and see how much stuff she's actually being weighed down by. Senshi is a typical dwarven miner and the head chef of the party, who ended up stuck in the dungeon about 10 years prior to the story and 4 years prior to the dungeon being discovered from the surface. He had to live within the dungeon eating whatever he could to survive, which made him extremely comfortable within the dungeon and very knowledgeable about the dungeon itself and all of its cuisine. Up until he met the main characters, he was somewhat of a caretaker for the dungeon, where he would clean up and maintain one of the more relaxed areas within the dungeon to help out the other adventurers, and was also on somewhat friendly terms with the orcs that lived on the deeper floors. So at least for the first few chapters, he feels much more like a tour guide showing them what's edible and what isn't as they venture deeper into the dungeon. But he fits into the group extremely well, with him and Leos basically trying to eat everything they come across. Now, Chilchuk is pretty worthless when it comes to combat, but he's a small halfling, so he takes care of a lot of the traps and secret passages that they have to navigate. He's probably the most relatable character for me personally, because he's very closed off and doesn't really want to get to know people due to his previous experiences at getting too friendly with party members, and I don't know, it's pretty relatable. But he starts off as a very reasonable, level-headed character who comes off as more of a voice of reason, even though he ends up going along with a lot of their stuff anyway. And he just kind of stuck around because he had already been paid for the job and is just going to see it through to the end. But it also feels like he genuinely cares about everybody else in the party too. He is by far the most boring character of the main party, but I think it's more of everyone else just being a bit too eccentric in comparison, because he's just pretty normal. And lastly, for the main group, Izutsumi is a very independent and almost antisocial member. She's got a lot of issues and was initially in another party, and she just completely split off from them to follow Laios's party and get Marcel to help her out by threatening everybody. Initially, she doesn't see any of them as friends and had a pretty rough childhood that made her a much more closed-off individual. But as she spends more and more time with them and gets to know them personally, she's become a pretty solid group member and a lot more friendly with everyone. But she's an extremely picky eater and refuses to try a lot of the food that they made. There's also some side characters that are pretty cool, like the leader of the Canaries, Mithron, is just awesome, and this random adventurer who turns into a pretty big part of the story overall, Kabru, he's pretty cool. There's the original group members that ended up leaving after the dragon encounter, Shuro and Namari, who show up with different parties throughout the story. And of course the mad sorcerer Thistle, and I'll talk more about him in a bit. But just about every one of these characters have really interesting backstories, except maybe Chilchuck. His was just kind of boring and meh, but all of them basically lean into the characters and help expand their personalities more and more. And I think that some of the side characters just have the best backstories entirely, like Mithron and Kabru having first-hand experiences of what the dungeons are actually capable of, but from different perspectives that just build up a much larger picture for the reader. It's just really good content. And as far as the character designs go, I don't really think that any of them had bad designs by any means, but as far as unique and interesting, I think most of the characters definitely look like they should be side characters. Everyone in the story just looks fairly boring, but I also think that it really makes their personalities stand out that much more. They don't need to be all flashy and wild to stand out in the world, just to show that they're the major characters in the sea of background NPCs, but it's more that they look like they would just fit into the world just like any other character, and that's completely fine with me. But all of these characters are connected by the dungeon. In order to explain how the dungeon works, I'm just going to go into the background of Thistle and some spoiler territory that might be pushing into a major spoiler. So here's an extra warning just in case. In the beginning of the story, Thistle is known as the Mad Sorcerer, and he's the lord of the dungeon. Everybody is under the impression that he created the dungeon, and once you defeat him, then you become the ruler of it, because the Dead King's ghost showed up one day on the surface and claimed that was the case. But it's not exactly right, and was more of a trap than anything else. Thistle was actually a court mage for the city, and the king became increasingly paranoid throughout his reign, and basically told Thistle of how much he was afraid of death. And I guess Thistle took this as a challenge and ended up finding a dungeon beneath the city that he spent a lot of time investigating and exploring, where he ended up making a deal with a winged lion to actually become the lord of the dungeon. And from that, Thistle decided that he was going to protect everybody and make sure nobody would die within his dungeon that swallowed the entire kingdom. He eventually became mad with power, and the dungeon was just forgotten until they discovered it 1,000 years later. But Thistle is in complete control of the dungeon for most of the story thus far, and everything within the dungeon is based on his own rule set, and is basically just the dilapidated ruins of the kingdom from 1,000 years prior. So within the dungeon, deaths don't really exist the same way that they exist on the surface, which is something that initially really annoyed me until it got further explained. Making it so deaths don't really matter is such a stupid mechanic for stories, in my opinion. It completely negates all stakes in battle if they can just easily be revived, and it makes for a story where nothing really matters and there's no gravity to any situation. But they expanded on the idea just a little more in the story, and it ended up being pretty situational because the souls just get kind of trapped in the dungeon, and the fresh corpses are much easier to revive than like decomposed corpses, and they end up having to use like animals as sacrifices if they're missing too much of themselves to be brought back to life. And it's a really delicate balance of collecting the pieces of the deceased and making sure that you don't really miss anything and have enough flesh and blood to make them whole again, which makes it a very easy thing to fuck up. And that explanation pretty much fixed any problem that I had with the mechanic, because it's actually a lot harder for it to be successful, and there's a lot of people throughout the dungeon who literally retrieve corpses and then just extort people to get them revived, which I think is a pretty interesting way to make money in this world. But within the dungeon, basically anything the dungeon lord desires comes true. So whoever controls the dungeon is basically a god as long as they're inside the dungeon. So anything just becomes possible. Everybody's trying to reach the end of the dungeon to get the chance to fight and kill Thistle and just take over. But realistically, he's... Stupid jokes aside, since he's in control of everything within the dungeon, he can still be killed, but in order to make it happen, a ton of things need to go exactly right, and the dungeon itself basically has to allow it, or he needs to let his guard down. It's really interesting to think about, and it really makes me enjoy the series more. While reading it, it definitely felt like they were going into a losing battle the entire time, but then everything slowly started falling into place, and then it all comes out that it was specifically designed this way. Especially with chapter 91 playing out like it did, everything flows exactly as it was planned out, until it doesn't. It's a very unpredictable series that really captivated me more than just about every other story that I've read. It genuinely feels like a really nice and chill adventure story at first, but then it ends up taking on some pretty unexpectedly dark and heavy themes the further you get into reading it. Some of the major things being like cannibalism, dealing with loneliness and death, and the idea of desire corrupting you so much that it turns into madness that you can't control. I'm a big fan of the darker topics and stories that sometimes can be a little too uncomfortable, but here it does a really good job of walking along the line where you feel like it might go a bit further than you expected, but never fully going all the way and staying a lot more lighthearted in general, which definitely ends up making the series feel a bit more parody-like than it actually is, but I don't necessarily see that as a bad thing. I don't think as a series it does any specific topic extremely well, but it does everything at a pretty good level. It doesn't really seem like any one aspect of the story is lacking severely. Everything's pretty much on the higher tier of good content, which it's super easy to find a story that's really good at one thing but lacks in everything else, but this does really good in everything, making it a pretty great story. Look, I can sit here and go on and on about how much I enjoyed just about every single aspect of the story, but I think this is a good enough place to stop for now, and I'll probably end up making some more videos later on, since this is definitely a series that I fully recommend and can't get enough of. The anime should hopefully be coming out sometime soon, and it's being done by Studio Trigger, so you know it's gonna end up pretty good. But until then, I'm looking forward to every single new chapter. Overall, Dungeon Meshi is pretty great. Thanks for watching.